Hello, my name is Steve Orrin, and I'm the Chief Technologist for Intel's Federal Division. Today we're going to talk about IoT, or Internet of Things, and Industrial Control System security. Our quick agenda will be an overview of some of the key security challenges in IoT, industrial control systems, some of the regulatory and complexity challenges associated with these technology and architectures. Then we'll talk about Intel's vision for IoT security and some of the fundamental capabilities and building blocks that are built into the infrastructure, built into the platforms that can be leveraged in order to help achieve security, compliance, and management of these systems and environments. And then we'll talk about some examples and use cases of how it's used, how these technologies and capabilities are used to get to an end-to-end secure solution. And then we'll wrap up with a summary and some best practice and guidance for how to implement security and how to go about operationalizing it. There are a lot of current issues when it comes to protecting Internet of Things and industrial control systems. It starts with the increased complexity of enterprise networks and industrial control systems coming together for the first time, the inclusion of internet all the way to the edge device, the interdependencies of those systems between each other, and the increasing interdependency between internet and enterprise systems and these control systems. The other thing to keep in mind is that while the complexity of real-time controls is increasing, at the same time we have these legacy systems coming together that just weren't built for security. There's also market dynamics. We're seeing the restructuring of the environment such that we have an increased volume of transactions, narrow margins for error, whether it be monetary or engineering side. And the other thing that's really been a driver, and we'll see more about this later, is the accessibility of these systems. In the past, only really the companies involved in those industrial systems or in those edge devices really had access to them. And now researchers, universities, and unfortunately hackers have easy access to those same devices and same software and those same environments and can do the vulnerability analysis and are publishing that information. Plus, the systems themselves are becoming more accessible, whether it be through wireless protocols or out on the internet. We're seeing some trends here. This is just one from earlier this year from Dark Reading that was talking about 3,000 industrial plants per year have been infected by malware. And these include both ones that are targeting industrial control systems as well as ones that are just infecting networks and systems that happen to be connected to the network and that the malware finds a way onto. So what are some of the threats to Internet of Things and industrial control systems? Well, obviously disrupting operations of the ICS by either delaying or blocking the flow of information across control networks, therefore denying availability to the control operators, sending false information, either to disguise unauthorized changes or to actually initiate inappropriate actions. If you tell the operator that something's going wrong, and then through false information, and then they adjust the settings, even though the system itself is reporting normal, they themselves then put that system into an abnormal state. Obviously, modifying system software will produce unpredictable and usually damaging results. Interfering with operations and safety systems, making changes to the PLCs and RTUs. Even something as scary as changing the alarm thresholds and settings so that no one knows when something's going wrong. And that can lead to not only damage, but potentially loss of life. Ordering premature shutdowns of process, disabling control equipment. These are all the kinds of threats that we see in the industrial control space. And they apply equally to the Internet of Things space. But in the Internet of Things space, obviously you have much more software and much more functionality in many cases that can be taken advantage of. Another key trend to monitor, and I mentioned this earlier about the accessibility of the systems, is the trends and interest in IoT and industrial control. And over the last several years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of IoT and ICS presentations at security conferences. We've also seen the number of conferences, locations globally rise. So there are more conferences in more locations, educating more people on these systems. And we're seeing an increase in the number of subculture information sharing networks and the visibility of connected things and ICS vulnerability research. I mean, I've shown here a couple examples. This is one from last year's DEF CON exploiting seismological networks and seismographs, as well as we're seeing, every conference, there's sometimes just a few sessions dedicated to ICS and IoT. In many cases, especially at the larger security conferences, there are whole tracks dedicated to these topics. And in some cases, we're seeing now whole conferences dedicated just to the vulnerability research and threat landscape for IoT and industrial control systems. So the threat is increasing, and the knowledge of the threat adversary is also increasing. At the same time, we in the security industry are being able to take advantage of these same conferences and the same material to educate ourselves on how to protect and how to defend these systems. So over the next 2 slides, I'm going to go through various examples of where attacks have been successful against Internet of Things and industrial control systems. I'm not going to go through all of them, but what you'll see in this format is a short description of what occurred and where, and some of the lessons learned when the analysis was done on what happened and what could have been done to help mitigate it. And you should use this as a guidepost of the kinds of things that we need to put into place at the system level, at the enterprise level, and at the whole solution level in order to help defend against these kinds of threats. And they do range from accidental infection. In one case, we had a system that was infected because a system was connected to the internet for an update, to targeted attack. And so in the first example here of the pipeline communications infrastructure, devices were used in an attack against a third party. So the device configuration was what was contributed to the compromise. It enabled them to get onto the system through a misconfigured device. And the problem was that because it was an edge device, it wasn't on the normal enterprise network. It wasn't the detection of what had happened did not take place because of the normal security controls they had on the enterprise side. They had to wait until they detected the problem on the other side and then do forensics to go find out what had gone wrong. And the lessons learned here is that you need to verify your device configuration, and you need to isolate critical systems from the internet. In the case of the nuclear power plant, it was a cyber infection. The slammer worm infected the plant. And what you saw here was that it started at a contractor site, and then when the contractor came into the corporate network, it jumped from corporate to plant network, and then once it was there, it found its way onto an unpatched server that had been, with a patch that had been available for 6 months. So this is a great example of where malware was just infecting systems that it was able to access, and it happened to get onto some very sensitive systems. And so the lesson here, of course, is make sure you always are patching to the latest version of the patches, but also about that trusted access channel. When you're bringing in third parties and contractors, make sure that you have proper controls in place and what their systems can talk to, and proper separation and isolation. And you'll see examples throughout this slide and the next that go to the heart of making sure you patch, make sure you understand what devices are accessing your system, and put in the appropriate controls in order to protect systems from each other. So the other thing to keep in mind, and this is illustrated in the oil platform incident, is that sometimes the bad guy is on the inside. In this case, it was a disgruntled employee who disrupted process control computer and leaked it, and the leak detection system was periodically disabled. And that's a key thing, a key system in the oil platform environment that needs to be available all the time to detect when something's gone wrong. And this was, again, an example of a disgruntled internal contractor that was able to damage corporate systems. And so not only do we have to protect the systems themselves, but we do have to implement security as a enterprise-wide mantra, and make sure that we're providing the proper controls for insider threat, whether it be through access control, proper policies, monitoring, and management, and being able to detect when something's gone wrong early. You can't just protect from the outside threat. You need to be able to have a defense in-depth policy that goes all the way to the systems themselves. The next one, the water utility that loses control, the actual outcome of this is that residents lost water. And so it impacted about 10,000 residents of that city, and they went without water. And part of the problem here is that the utility operator went to do its update over a direct connection to the internet, and obviously the system got virus once it was connected to the internet, causing it to crash. The reason it crashed wasn't that the malware was targeting that system, but the industrial control system just couldn't handle the malware, and it shut down. It shut down. It caused it to crash. And so this is a great example of not only do we need to keep system patches, but we need to do it properly. You can't just put a system on the internet and download patches. You have to have proper DMZs and isolation and concentric circles of protection to protect the most critical systems like this industrial control system from direct access to the internet. Finally, there's a water facility that was accessed via the internet. This was another example of not having proper controls in place, proper DMZ, as well as just having default passwords. And this is something that we've seen a lot throughout the industrial control and Internet of Things environments, is that because you feel like they're on the inside, I don't have to do the same security that I would for a laptop or a server that's sitting out in my enterprise network. And that isn't true. The industrial control system, the Internet of Things systems are just as susceptible and need to be protected with the same level of due diligence. And that means making sure that you have good passwords and strong changing them out on a regular basis, making sure that you have different levels of control, roles and responsibilities defined, and obviously making sure that you don't put system details out on public-facing systems. So if we overview some additional challenges to the IoT and industrial things, mentioned this before about the complexity, and really where it comes down to is we're seeing standards based protocols slowly replacing vendor-specific proprietary communication systems. While that would, from an engineering perspective, that's a good thing that standards are replacing vendor-specific, there is an adverse effect here, and that is that these protocols, if I attack and I can find a vulnerability in one, I now have a much broader attack point or surface to go after. So as things become more standardized, that means more and more systems can be susceptible if a vulnerability is discovered or if an attack vector is implemented across that protocol or across that standard. And so there is a balance there, and we do need to move to standardization because of the next two reasons. These systems are becoming much more interconnected, and the complexity involved with interconnecting systems, it's in the seams where things go wrong. And whether that seam be the most obvious one, the IT to OT, the Internet Information Technology to operational technology barrier, to the interconnectedness across domain, across organization, and across system. It's really in the seams where things tend to fall apart, and that interconnectedness is important to make sure that we secure. The last piece here is that we are becoming, as a society and as these systems, more reliant on public information systems, on the internet, on the telco systems. And because we're reliant on them, they become part of our trust and part of our security boundary. And we need to make sure that we're protected from them, but also that we're protecting our access based on them. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are regulatory and certification requirements for many of these systems, whether you're working on federally mandated requirements like FISMA and FedRAMP, or some of the NIST standards, or you look at some of the NIST standards like the Guide to Industrial Control Systems are really good guidelines for what you need to do in order to start protecting systems that are going to live in an industrial control environment. These are just some indicators of the kind of security requirements that are needed in order to achieve security in industrial control systems. So let's switch gears for a second and talk about, okay, we've talked about the threats and the kinds of attacks, and there are a lot of them, and there's a lot more detail in there as well as references to some of the more attacks that have happened, but what do we do about it? And so what Intel's focus is really to provide security, protection, identification assurance to all the nodes in an IoT ecosystem. And that starts with designed-in security from the foundation. So need to be able to build security in from the ground floor into the systems themselves, and then enable those features to be leveraged by the programmers, the developers, and the ecosystem. We also are building in an architecture that builds a platform security in. So solutions and software integrated to work from the edge all the way to the cloud, to go across those seams, to be so that the interdependencies and those protocols are secure end to end. And then building a set of services that it can equip both the existing security tools and technologies and software as well as future ones to be able to operate on and protect these Internet of Things and industrial control systems. So enabling the security services to be able to take advantage of features in hardware and firmware and software in order to better manage and better secure the system. So what you see here is a tiered approach of designed in, built in, and then giving those services and those capabilities up the stack all the way from the edge to the cloud. And so, as I mentioned, it starts from being designed in. Security in the foundation, and what Intel is doing is providing consistent security features and a unified programming model across all of our platforms. And it starts with having a consistent set of capabilities built in, so that when you get an Intel-based platform, you know it's going to have hardware and software identification capability, secure and protected boot, protected storage, and trusted execution capabilities. And what these features allow you to do is to be able to trust that you will have capabilities in each of these categories available to the software and to the operating environment and solution at each step of the process, from across all the edge devices to the gateways to the aggregation points and networks up through to the cloud and back-end data systems. And so that you can have a unified view of how you're securing those systems and how you're pushing security all the way to the edge. As I mentioned, it's built in, and this is about providing that end-to-end solution. So not just the hard and edge, but the full life cycle, both edge to cloud, as well as the management and security communications that are necessary to protect those Internet of Things and industrial control systems. And because Intel exists at each step of that process, because we're at the edge and in the network and at the back end and on the security management tools, we can provide that holistic approach to how do you do an integrated edge to cloud and fully managed and secure solution. And finally, enabling those services, the trust services on top of that, to really drive the lifecycle security services on demand. And this equips both the threat defenders as well as the monitoring and management solutions to be able to verify devices, provide onboarding and attestation, push configuration, and know that you're talking to a secure device, really enabling the ecosystem of ISVs, of software providers and security providers, to secure the Internet of Things systems. This platform strategy, this portfolio strategy really is about its consistency across our entire ecosystem. So it's, as I mentioned before, it starts at the foundation, building that in from client, from the edge all the way to the cloud, and having those consistent capabilities. And what you'll see from Intel going, starting this year, last year, and moving forward, is that consistency of capability across all of our platforms. And doing that from the client and IoT through the Internet of Things, whether it be automotive and drones, to the data center, to our comms, to our programmable logic. So all of our systems are going to get that consistent foundation. And then driving those capabilities and working with the ecosystem and the ISV community, the OEM community, and the software and the operating system community to enable their products and services to take advantage of those security features and be able to operate in these various different domains. At the same time, enabling the developer community, both through developer tools, developer training, as well as to the open source community, so that they have access to the tools and access to the software they need in order to be able to take advantage of the hardware and the firmware security features. And then finally, delivering services up the stack. So I mentioned earlier this vision for device security, and so what it really comes down to is being able to provide trusted execution, device and software identification, management, verified or secure boot, and secure storage across all of our devices. And these are just some examples of some of the technologies available today, for instance, in our client and our gateway platforms, that allow you to be able to get a capability in each of those categories. And so whether things like software guard extensions, or EPID or enhanced privacy ID to give you device ID, being able to manage these things using Mesh Central, secure boot using TXT, for example, and secure storage using a TPM or the platform trusted technology. These are just examples of the technologies available today on the platforms that can be leveraged to give you these consistent capabilities across all of our devices. So let's talk up a little bit about what these fundamental capabilities and what we do when we're looking at an industrial control or IoT environment. And really, I'm going to focus on three areas: on embedded security, to be able to provide security isolation and endpoint protection; the secure communications that you need machine to machine with confidentiality and integrity; and then the secure monitoring and management for these systems. So what we're doing is we're going to talk about how we take these capabilities that we talked about in the prior slides and bring them into a solution focus, that built-on focus of how do I then build out an IoT or an industrial control system security solution based on these technologies. So let's start with the security isolation options. one thing to recognize is that there isn't a silver bullet for security. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so what we've done with our platforms and our gateways is really enable the multitude of capabilities that you're going to have available at different parts of the infrastructure. And so starting at the top, the easiest and quickest to deploy is the process isolation. So being able to provide security separation across processes within the same OS. And that may be useful, especially within a certain security domain. So you're within the same security domain, and so being able to have both operational and monitoring and management separated by process within the OS. But at the same time, you can up the ante with the containerization using both software and or hardware containerization to be able to further separate those application functionality. We see this a lot of times when you want to do data versus control plane separation or management versus control plane separation. Supporting virtualization-based isolation, so being able to create security separations between the operating systems. This is really important and useful for when you're dealing with legacy systems being brought into new environments, or being able to deploy a newer security control or management monitoring control into an environment that has legacy OSs. And so being able to do that virtualization-based isolation down at the hardware allows you to have both legacy, potentially vulnerable operating systems operating on the same physical device as the newer ones that can manage and monitor it. And then finally, the full spectrum one is the physical isolation or gateway or bump in the wire based approaches. And our gateways can support the daisy chaining of these things, as well as the daisy chaining to the edge devices, so that you can create that true physical air gap style isolation between, say, the IT and OT boundary, or between different types of security domains within the control system environment, critical systems from non-critical systems and the like, and using that gateway as an intermediary between those two environments to provide that bump in the wire or gateway-based approach. And so as I mentioned, there is no silver bullet, and it doesn't a one-size-fits-all when it comes to security isolation, whether it be network segmentation or onboard process isolation. The important thing here is that what Intel has done is created a single platform that can be operated on in these multiple environments. So you pick one device and then you can use it and choose the best solution implementation for the environment that you're in. To take this a step further, to look at some examples within and this is just an example from a power generation facility, you can see the different places where it would make sense to use different isolation and security segmentation approaches. So like I said, up at the top there, you see that within the same security domain, you can use different containerization methodologies based on what you're trying to accomplish. So for instance, same OS for some of the control systems, virtualization for some of the legacy systems that you're trying to apply some new capability or new management for. In the case of the containerization, being able to add a monitoring agent to an existing system without interfering with that existing system. And then using the gateway or bump in the wire approach, the physical separation for the IT-OT barrier. It's really all about keeping separation. It's all about the separation of security domains apart from each other, as well as separating the operational from the enterprise and IT management domains as well. And so being able to implement these micro DMZs and network segmentation and on-box and process separation and isolation allows you to create that defense in depth of those concentric circles of protection, so that you can really provide varying security controls when they're needed, as they're needed, to the right application without lumping a lot of disparate things together. And so it gives you with a single platform, you can implement the varying security models that are necessary to secure a very complex inter-reliant system. In the communications channel, there's several things that need to be done here. You want to be able to provide security management monitoring at the same time that you're also supporting the normal operations of the system. So traffic channel, you want to keep those channels separate, but you do need to have the device talk to those same things. And so being able to have separate communications channels when needed between the application and control data from the management and security data, be able to apply security to those communications channels, both to the comms channels for the application data, as well as for the security channels, and making decisions based on the infrastructure you have of which ones you want to turn on the transport security for, which ones you need to have quality of service. Control channel team tends to need to have high reliability, because it's the control channel, whereas security management doesn't necessarily need the same level of quality of service. And so having a platform that allows you to dial in on the security for the comms. What's built in as far as security comes, you have end-to-end encryption, end-to-end integrity protection, machine-to-machine authentication and authorization using device identification, software identification, and being able to provide authentication access control decisions at the edge and at the gateway. And then using the gateways as aggregation points so that if you have legacy systems that may not be able to handle the full encryption or may not be able to handle the full suite of protocols that you want to apply, using the gateways as an aggregation point and a stop in order to be able to enforce stronger security controls on the communications, be able to push management to the gateway and then have the gateway arbitrate on behalf of the backend system. And while at the same time, it does allow you to be able to loosely couple these things together such that if you do not want to affect existing operational services, you do not want to take bandwidth or take communications from the existing control and data planes of the industrial control system, that allows you to be able to add security on, to evolve it independently of the OT processes in the environments where you can't go in greenfield and put in the newer devices. And so it allows you to leverage the brownfield or leverage the legacy systems and apply security at the comms channel layer and the authentication and authorization, while at the same time maintaining the same level of quality of service for the application, data, and control planes of communications. Can't forget about security management. One of the key things, and it's something I've said many times, is that if you don't know a system, if you can't find a system, you can't manage a system, then how can you secure it? And so one of the key things is, how do you manage and control the security of these solutions? And that's a combination of being able to provide consistent security APIs across devices so that you have a management infrastructure that you can apply at the OS, below the OS, and the virtualization, and all those physically isolated environments that we talked about earlier, and be able to provide a single plain pane of glass view to those devices, be able to authenticate that that is the edge device, apply security controls across those devices, and be able to support the varying security models that you'd implemented. Be able to push security policies out to those devices regardless of the deployment model, whether it be the process isolation to physical isolation at the edge in the cloud, to give you that single control plane and that single management plane view, and be able to push and manage those systems through a consistent API across all the devices. And then be able to give you that visibility so that you can start to gather the events, the logs from all of these devices, and do, whether it be in the data center or up in the cloud, centralized analytics, and be able to do this alongside. And so while you're monitoring the systems for your operational, being able to apply IT security monitoring to those same systems and be able to correlate across them allows you to be able to see, well, this system is acting a little bit out of fashion. Is it because of a security vulnerability or a misconfiguration, or is it because something is really going wrong? And be able to get that visibility across all of the endpoints and communications. Really, at the end of the day, the goal here is to be able to create near real-time risk measurement capabilities, to be able to real-time know what the status of the systems are. Just like what we do in the industrial control space. So you know in real time whether or not a system is operating at the correct way, or if it's operating efficiently. That same level of visibility and analytics can be applied to the security controls and the security environment for those devices, so that you know in real time what is the security and threat analysis of a given system or a given set of systems. And that is ultimately our goal, is to bring security to the same level of maturity in the IoT that the monitoring for those IoT and industrial control systems have for themselves. Finally, there's an important feedback loop that as you move policies out to the edge and you automate responses, that you learn from these things. And so by being able to have all the devices be able to send events and logs, and then being able to push the policies out, you create this nice feedback loop of, did the policy fix the problem? Was my automated response good enough? And then be able to do better the next time. And so increasing the sensitivity of alarms, being able to automate more of the policy push and the changes, be able to move to a more secure domain. So going from just process isolation, maybe moving things to virtualization or containerization based approach of isolation, as you become more comfortable with that the policies and controls will not affect operations. And so having that monitoring management feedback loop where you're monitoring the systems and you're managing them, and the two are talking to each other, will enable you to get to a more automated approach, quicker response times, and ultimately better security policies for the systems and for their operational environment. I mentioned earlier that our third stage of what Intel's strategy is about that enabling of services. And so one of the things that we're also doing is pushing these security capabilities, the management and the monitoring capabilities, as a service model as well. And so whether it be from the cloud or from the data center, being able to get the security as a service as part of the logical view, same way that you have the operational context. And so being able to do security management, monitoring, communication security, and endpoint security as services as well, so that you can then more automate and provide more centralized functionality for how you're going to do management and monitoring across the IT and security operations. And so be able to apply those to the same systems that you're doing the operational context without interfering with the operational context. At the same time, be able to take that all the way into a service model, so that if you look at how a lot of these environments are being managed, especially the remote ones, a lot of times there isn't a whole ID department right there on site. These could be remote monitoring stations, a pipeline, to be able to gather the data into a centralized location in a secure way, or be able to secure it all the way to the cloud, so that your centralized IT and security operations can manage multiple sites and manage these remote sites as well. And Intel is enabling these kind of capabilities through our consistent APIs and working with the cloud providers and the solution providers that are providing these security management and monitoring capabilities and governance risk compliance capabilities, and enabling them with those APIs to talk to the hardware, be able to do it in a secure fashion and get the information out of those systems and apply policies to those systems. So here's an example of where this has been done at a power station. In this example, we had both brownfield environments as well as greenfield. In the brownfield environments, using the gateway as an aggregation point, as that physical process separation, as we were talking about earlier, the bump in the wire, to apply security controls, both being able to supply secure communications from the edge to the cloud, where the edge devices, the actual edge devices, were incapable of doing the actual encryption. And so using the gateway as an aggregate, as a proxy, if you will, between the edge and the cloud and the IT systems, and be able to secure the communications both from the edge to the cloud, provide secure management and monitoring, but also be able to do the gateway to gateway, or the machine to machine intersecurity. So between different gateways that we're able to manage and secure across different systems, we enabled those edge devices to be able to talk to each other in a secure fashion for the first time. The system in the environment also had greenfield environments, so we were able to deploy some more modern edge devices that were built on modern systems that had the security built in, so they were able to do encryption, secure boot, and machine-to-machine authentication within the edge device, and then use those secure protocols to talk directly to that same secure management and monitoring cloud. And so showing the implementation in both a brownfield and greenfield based environment, leveraging these device capabilities both at the gateway and all the way at the edge to implement the full solution suite here. And so what we did was we partnered with Schneider and Live Data to implement both the embedded physical security, the secure communications, and the monitoring and management into a power station environment, and showed how you would deploy these solutions both in the brownfield and greenfield use cases. Another example of where we've been working on end-to-end security is in the ISR environment, specifically looking at surveillance, computer vision surveillance. So using some Intel technologies, the RealSense camera, and some of our other capabilities, be able to provide edge to back-end data center secure communications to those sensors at the edge, collecting information and being able to secure that information all the way up to the back end. The other interesting thing in this specific use case was being able to do sensor-to-sensor correlation, so being able to pick up data securely from multiple sensors, but then to have the sensors recognize that where their fidelity was compromised, where they weren't getting good data out of a particular sensor, to retask other sensors to pull in data to help augment the ones that weren't getting the accurate or really high fidelity data, and to so enable that machine-to-machine communication in a secure fashion using those gateway devices. Ultimately, what the key thing here is being able to show the sensor to cloud and secure analytics into end use case, again, leveraging the gateways to be able to make that happen. Let's talk about some best practices. When you look at implementing security across an IoT or industrial control system, there are some key things you want to look at. Number one, protect what's most important, sometimes referred to as data islanding or secure enclaving. Figure out what your most important data is and make sure that you've got the right isolation and segmentation and process protections for that data. Consider implementing new layers, so implementing more layers between the data, the critical systems, and the control system and the operational side of the camp. Also, always think beyond intrusion prevention. A lot of folks get very focused on how do I prevent this threat? How do I prevent this specific attack? How do I make sure I'm patched up to date? It's just as important to know what to do once you are attacked, because it will happen. And so knowing what to do post-infection and post-detection. What is your mitigation? What policies are you going to put in place once you've detected that there's been an attack or that there's been an infection? How are you going to deploy the update? How are you going to deploy the mitigation out to the field or out to the edge device? How are you going to monitor to make sure the effectiveness of your controls? And what is your incident response, not just from a technical perspective, but also from a people perspective? Who needs to be notified? Who needs to be brought into the loop and into the war room to do the discussions? And what you'll find is it actually crosses more barriers. So it's important to think about it's not just the IT people and the security people and the operational technology people. Many times it's bringing in lawyers and PR and the executive suite. Having a coordinated response plan is just as important as having a coordinated mitigation plan or a detection plan. From a threat perspective, you want to be able to get at the kill chain, so deny, disrupt, disable, and destroy. So prevent the malware from getting access, prevent the malware from causing damage once it has access, disable its ability to spread, and then ultimately mitigate. And so having a strategy that looks at all four stages of that is just as important. Also, as we saw in some of the examples, it's important to protect your supply chain. Know where your systems are coming and be able to identify those systems, know who your third-party contractors are, know what systems you're interdependent on, what internet, telco, and other services are you dependent on for your operations, and be able to know what the security policies are for those. And always maintain an open dialogue with these suppliers and customers so that you know when a third party has been feeling an infection from malware, you know to be ready that might have jumped over the wire to your side as well. Remember that security is a journey, it's not a destination, and you need to be constantly vigilant. You obviously want to prepare and predict, so managing your risk, understanding what are your important assets, making sure you're in compliance, but do regular security assessments, implement the security management program, and really look at the security from the different kinds of use cases. If you're in a healthcare environment, make sure you're providing the right IT security specific to what that healthcare requirements are. If you're in the oil and gas, you're going to have specific requirements, whether it be for leak detection, that's going to be your most important asset. Understanding what your most important assets are, implementing the perimeter protections, whether it be the standard stuff like firewalls and IPSs and scanning capability that you have to do, but at the same time, have your respond, recover, and restore mechanisms in place. Be able to do threat suppression. Look at penetration testing and digital forensics as ways to enable your teams to have better visibility into what's going on or what could go on in your site environment. Awareness training, be able to do social engineering training, and physical baseline and system security reviews, looking at everything from the physical access down to the digital access, and always make sure that you're doing proper training and monitoring of the staff to prevent the insider. And then know your baseline. So the standard stuff, make sure you have proper identity access control and credential issuance. You're doing data discovery, data loss prevention, proper security for your controls, for your SSL certificates, sort of the bread and butter of identity and access management, and making sure that you're able to do data security and data management across the life cycle. Finally, and this is probably one of the most important things, we often look at these IoT and industrial control systems, and we look at all the things we want to do, and we want to connect things together and then get the analysis and get that data and start getting to predictive maintenance or predictive operations. One thing that we often forget is that it's important that security needs to be built in. It's not a bolt-on. And then this slide here, what it shows is that security is at the very beginning. So the first thing is you figure out how you're going to connect your systems together. And then the next thing you should be doing is figuring out how you're going to secure and manage those systems you just connected. Because if you can't secure them and you don't manage them, no matter how much analytics and prediction and wonderful value you get, it becomes infinitely harder to secure them later. And when something goes wrong, you lose all that value because now you're dealing with a serious vulnerability or a serious exposure. And so the best practice is that when after you've connected the system again and figure out how they're going to make them work, that's the right time to think about how you're going to secure them and how you're going to manage them. And that way you're set up to be able to go and extract the value, the return on investment for the analytics and IoT capabilities, and be able to get to those wonderful future states of prediction and optimization built on top of a secure and manageable environment. So I have a question here around, are there learnings from Stuxnet attack around industrial control systems that we can use to prevent future predecessors of Stuxnet? Well, Stuxnet was a very interesting one, and while you can go look at the literature to find the analysis, and I'm not going to talk about attribution, one of the key things around Stuxnet was, number one, it was very targeted, specifically at specific PLCs and industrial control systems, and it took advantage of a variety of threats and attack techniques, many of which were 0 days, or in other words, were unknown prior to the release of Stuxnet. And they ranged across multiple systems in order to do its job. And it was also, one of the other things to keep in mind, it was very stealthy in its early days. So it was infecting for a very long time before it went live and started doing the damage. And it's only after it started becoming noisy, as we say, that people started to detect it. It had been out there for years with no detection whatsoever. So some of the interesting lessons learned and things that from an industry is that isolation and segmentation and proper controls. Ultimately, what led to that final hop in the wire when it went from the PC or the laptop it infected to the controller is where they took a system that had been connected to the internet, at some point in time connected to the network, and connected it physically to the PLC. They plugged it in. And so this is where proper policies, procedures, and isolation come into play. If you make sure that you scan all systems prior to connecting them, and you don't ever breach the air gap with systems across that. You verify the uploads that you're going to use to move them across. You do whitelisting on the systems that you're going to connect to the PLC, so only the software you expect to be running there is running there. That could have helped. It wouldn't have prevented everything. There were some really interesting attacks on there, but that would have protected against a large amount of the scale of the attack and the infection rate. Is if they had done proper isolation controls of the systems and proper isolation controls of what was able to talk and apply whitelisting to the platforms themselves. Thank you. My name is Steve Orrin. Again, I'm the Chief Technologist for Intel's Federal Division, and thank you for your time today.